A shadow on the floor demarcates Peter Stamatin's overall attitude. A silhouette frames his position in the world. In the original game, Peter stands relatively tall. His coat is hung confidently over his shoulders. He stands as a prince. A prince fallen far, certainly, but there's a regal bearing to him, a dignity that he has mostly lost, and it does fade when you engage with him in most conversations. But still, there is pride he tries to retain. The hollow-eyed face you see when you enter conversation with him in the original game is a reflection of everything he currently believes, that is, very little. In Pathologic 2, his coat is larger, fatter. It sits atop his shoulders like a hunch. His stance is less. He seems weighed down by his own clothing. It is the burden that he wears, self-applied and self-fulfilling. A character who believes his suffering is deserved. A wretched, almost lonely figure, but never a figure of humor, as the game documents wisely tell us. Many characters with drug, alcohol, or other addictive habits are often rendered objects of humor, derision, or even as odd ones out. They're generally there in media for the more normal folk to laugh at. Look at how they cannot control themselves so. See their weakness laid bare, the crucial part of their character, and also the thing most ready to be ridiculed. There's this quote from him in Pathologic 2. "Why are you looking at me so funny, huh? It's not like I told a joke." It says a lot about how players are expected to see Peter as a stereotype of an artist, hunched, withdrawn, obsessive, to a point of repulsion, and a mixture of enraptured by the beauty of the simple things in life and an incredible pessimism that encourages suicidal tendencies. Stripped of his coat, he is a gaunt, sad figure, merely trying to make the best of a poor situation by ironically making it worse. It is important to note that Peter, while depressive and oftentimes pessimistic, "Leave me be, old boy," he says, "let me die with dignity," he is also still an artist. There remains in him a passion for life and art that, while few others can see from his point of view, keeps him going. He seems to create art for art's sake, or to escape the polyhedron, and stays up late at night scribbling notes down on new concepts for radical new constructions. As the original game design documents say, Peter is calmer than his twin brother. He is more obsessed in the process of creation. He is more precise, careful, and pedantic. Peter's house serves as a studio, cluttered with blueprints, sketches, and plans, piles of books on architecture in 5 different languages, and his university notes on the theory of the strength of materials. The walls are covered in spots of wine, paint, and blood, traces of sleepless nights and creative search. Across the walls of his loft in both games, countless images and diagrams of the polyhedron and proto-polyhedrons can be seen. A map of the town sits beside it on the wall. Perhaps he finds orienting himself in this place just as difficult as first-time players, seduced as he is by gazing at the polyhedron. He paints a lot in Pathologic 2. An image of melting faces, reminiscent of tragedians, seems to haunt his canvas. He is indeed stuck in an artistically depressed stupor. Perhaps he's figured out some inkling of the significance of what these strange actors represent. In both games, he has a bathtub situated in the middle of a room, connected to nothing, with no water in it. Often, stereotypical drunks are found in the bathtub. It may be that he has decided to lean into that particular stereotype. Either that, or he's completely fine with bathing in the middle of his room, unashamed of his body. Given the fact that bottles sit around the tub in Pathologic 2, I think we can safely assume it's the former. Peter is an excellent artist, exploring the boundaries of the reality in which he finds himself in. Artists, too, are often people left to be ridiculed. Weirdos, folk who are harder to understand, for instance. The strength of the artist, ironically, quite often comes from the external. The more who flock to the artist, the longer their memory is, the greater their impact. Even though the strength of the artist originates from the self, an artist over time can become more reliant on external factors. Wealth, fame, physical beauty. Art for art's sake, art from the self, becomes harder to find in a society bent on monetization, profit, and physical results. Money and the humanities do not mix. Money, a tool of exact amount, and humanities, often considered not a tool at all, an imprecise examination of the world through a multitude of lenses, a kaleidoscope of visions. Peter Stamatin sees the world this way, and it has made him lonely. The Bowie song I left as a quote at the beginning of the video is particularly relevant to Peter, I think. Bowie, the champion of the outsider throughout his whole life and dabbler in every form of art under the sun. Peter is an outsider if there has ever been one. he and his brother both geniuses estranged by society, at first by choice and then by force. They were commissioned by the Canes eventually to create a miracle, the heavenly abode that is the polyhedron. Now imagine making a painting, your magnum opus, your masterpiece, and you know it is so. Not only do you know it, but those who commissioned it tell you, as do hundreds of others. But for you, the painting is distant, taken out of your hands, it is no longer yours. Worse, the beauty you intended for it, the beauty that others say is there, can only be seen by those others. You glimpse it perhaps as you look out the corner of your eye. Confronting it becomes harder, especially when your work of art stands taller than anything else in the town in which you live. Eventually, madness takes you, a bitterness takes root in your heart, and you seek comfort away from art, somewhere to stop the pressing madness. There's an element of humiliation to Peter's ordeal, whether imagined by him or real. He cannot experience the beauty, just a broken, weakened version of it. He stares at it, drinking himself half to death, to see even a fraction of what others see. He adores his creation more than anything. He hates himself for making it. He says as much in Pathologic too. The polyhedron loves everyone, but it's ever unrequited. When he tries to commit suicide in the original Pathologic, there's a reason he does so beside a stairway to heaven, one of his prototypical polyhedrons. An unfinished skeleton, a frame that was barely born from his mind before he excised it. It didn't work, none of them did. They stand as reminders to him of his own failures. They didn't work, neither does he. To commit suicide in the shadow of his own creation is sad, gut-wrenching and awful. Fortunately, a shrewd bachelor can prevent this from happening, but the symbolism is telling. Peter lives forever in the shadow of the polyhedron. It destroyed him so much that he cannot even bear to die in its shadow, merely a shadow of a shadow. It is almost an artistic work in itself, though a particularly horrible and tragic one, of course. Peter has for some time forgone ideas of moderation and safety in his attitude to drinking, isolation and mental health, so he forfeits his physical health too in what he presumes will be a final act. Fortunately, I've always managed to save him. While the romanticization of suicide is notably awful and unhelpful anywhere and everywhere it can be found, I've listed a few mental health organizations you can donate to in the description. The idea of art relating to physical danger, the pushing of boundaries, etc., can be helpfully identified in a real-life American artist known as Chris Burden, who lived from 1946 to 2015. Burden's early work centered around his disregard for his own personal safety, placing his life in the hands of others, etc. His first performance work, for instance, involved him locking himself in a locker for 5 days. A later performance called Transfixed involved him being crucified on a Volkswagen Beetle, a nail driven through each of his palms. He was once bolted with copper bands to a gallery floor between buckets of water, each with a live electric line submerged within it so someone could kick over a bucket and electrocute him. All of these things seem, and probably are, quite sensationalist. There are countless videos and articles written about the man. He was a complicated fellow with some fascinating ideas about what art meant. He once said, "Art doesn't have a purpose. It's a free spot in society where you can do anything." American cultural critic Cynthia Carr wrote about Burden, saying that he took his risks in the manner of a scientist, one who decides he must test a new serum on himself alone, who later declares he always knew it would work. Peter Stamatin is a man who subjects himself to loneliness and isolation in the name of art, who does anything he can because it is art he is creating. He would agree with the idea of art being a free space in society where you can do anything for any purpose and make something special from nothing. Though I think for Peter, art does have a purpose. Peter always knew the polyhedron would work, I suspect. Once the formula was perfected, of course it would work, but I do not think he knew just how well it would work, the flaw in the design that would make him essentially blind and mad. Or perhaps he did know, and his efforts to produce art were closer to Burden's lack of self-preservation than one might initially think. Ice Pick Lodge's construction of Peter exists as a figure separated from the player, as do most characters in the game of course, but Peter is a special case. His esoteric speech comes from the fact that he sees things he cannot talk about. The beauty of the world is all around him, yet he remains indoors sculling twirine and painting pictures of screaming faces. The beauty he sees is reflected in the pain of being. Peter tries to speak to the meaning he sees in his artworks, but no one can ever relate to it. And it's this lack of understanding that drives him mad, aided by his isolation and eccentricity. Peter lives in the loft of his apartment building in both games. His brother lives in the basement of a bar in both games. The symbolism is obvious. One is closer to heaven than the other. One understands the utopian ideals. The other has the grit and fortitude to bring them to fruition. Andre is the battering ram. Peter is the invading army that pours through the gates, delivering a utopia on the back of his grand and inspirational ideas. God is not needed, for they can create God. Both brothers are based on the idea of Dostoyevsky's Karamazov brothers, who star in one of Dostoyevsky's greatest novels, The Brothers Karamazov, which was written over a period of 2 years and published as a serial from 1879 to 1880. It's a book that deals with existential and moral questions, as well as questions one could consider immediately practical, such as how to survive in a world that's undergoing a process of modernization. I must admit I've not finished it on release of this video, but it's a hugely engaging and enjoyable read for those who have an interest in theology, morality, existentialism, and Russian history in general. So Peter seems to be most like the middle brother, in my opinion, Ivan. He is, as Wikipedia helpfully describes, sullen and isolated, but also intellectually brilliant. He is disturbed by the unspeakable cruelty and senseless suffering in the world. Sounds quite familiar, yes? Peter is 29 years old, Ivan is 24. Ivan is described to have no positive affection towards his elder brother, much as Peter finds it difficult to like Andre at times. The parallels are obvious and many. As a novel, The Brothers Karamazov is often obsessed with questions of the divine, of God. The Karamazov brothers are often witnessed giving long diatribes on God, and Ivan in particular has a few very important monologues regarding the nature of human suffering, the absurdity of the idea of cosmic justice, and how human beings have created Satan in their own image. If God created humans, humans created evil. I will read to you one of the most crucial passages in the novel, from the chapter Rebellion. It's not God that I don't accept, Alyosha, only I most respectfully return him the ticket. That's rebellion, murmured Alyosha, looking down. Rebellion? I'm sorry you call it that, said Ivan earnestly. One can hardly live in rebellion, and I want to live. Tell me yourself, I challenge you. Answer. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me, and tell the truth. No, I wouldn't consent, said Alyosha softly. Peter Stamatin's creation of the polyhedron is predicated on the knowledge that suffering will ensue. You could consider it just his own suffering. His own misery is what fuels his character. His chances to bond with other human beings are reduced to either nods of appreciation towards his artworks, checking up on him to give him medicine, or a friendly drink. And yet, the entire structure of the polyhedron rests on the heart of the earth, the great miracle that fuels the town, that creates the plague and the cure. Peter has created a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last. But in order to make it work, the suffering of one creature is assured, the earth. It is an ecological parallel to the modern day, a price we pay for technology outstripping ethics, except this time it is artistic and architectural ambition, a desire to play God and beat the system in a spiritual and artistic way rather than strictly a technological way. Peter Stamatin perhaps suffers not just because his own work of art eludes him, but because his work of art brings the earth itself to its knees. His work is both the great wound and the bandage. His creation is on which the entire ideological dilemma of Pathologic's endings rest. Should such a marvelous creation be allowed to exist? A founding block of a new human race, a fresh start? But in turning our eyes towards the stars like that, we forget what it is to exist as humans as we are now. What we will become may not be as human as we'd like it to be. Changeling's solution in the end is to sacrifice the humans to keep the system intact. Is the town as a whole wonderful? Is it the people, or is it just Peter's polyhedron? Bowie again. There's a parallel there, I think. Sometimes I don't feel as if I'm a person at all, Bowie let slip in a 1972 interview. I'm just a collection of other people's ideas. Peter, by the time you meet him, has an existence fairly dictated by others. His brother, well-meaning and loving guardian, who watches over him with a terrible overbearing nature, that generally means he'll stab someone in the eye if they even vaguely threaten Peter. And the Canes, who want more miracles, who appreciate that Peter's mind can create more miracles. Peter, however, is spent. He's distant a lot of the time, a hodgepodge of ideas of humanity at the beginning of the game. He's elusive, erratic, and makes irritating requests of the Bachelor before he agrees to leave town in the first game. Just a collection of other people's ideas. It's true in more ways than one. Maybe he may just be a doll in the grand scheme of things, owned as he is by a pair of children playing a silly game. But he is a patchwork in the game world itself. Much as his coat is patchwork in the second game, Peter's ideas come from a wondrous imagination, though he finds little pleasure in living for himself. The music video for the song Ashes to Ashes reduces Bowie to a clown. He is an object of self-parody. The real Bowie, if there ever was such a thing he presented to us, has been subsumed and has become an object of typical ridicule. The real Bowie on the cover of the album Scary Monsters is torn in half. All that remains of the real David Bowie is the shadow. In Bowie's place stands the clown. Peter is, by the developer's own guidelines, not a clown under any circumstances, but yet that is what he is easy to reduce to. He might be written in a fine way, that makes him sympathetic, compassionate, and so on, but there can only be so much space for a single mind to fit all these characters in. Peter is a lonely soul, a character who should never be reduced to caricature, but who we find is very easy to make a caricature of. He's the blueprint of a tortured artist, but just because he can find others like him does not mean his struggles are rendered useless. He's never reduced to a clown-like figure by the writers. Icepick Lodge are careful never to reduce him to the status of parody. It's not necessarily the narrators of the story who mock him. But Peter does say in one of his voice lines that he considers himself a clown. "Don't teach me to dance, pal," he says. "Been a clown all my life." The real Peter is obscured somewhere beneath the polyhedron, which he considers more important than his own life. "If you truly value my life, then protect the polyhedron," he implores in 2. He is a depressed and tortured artist struggling to find meaning in the world where the meaning he created is invisible to him. The tortured artist is a dangerous myth. It's the way creative workers are treated that causes breakdown. You're supposed to turn your pain into art as an artist or a creator. That's why high art is often perceived as having come from a bad place or leaving you with a negative feeling. The best art, they say, comes from those who have struggled. Pain, however, is less an artistic necessity and more a result of contagion, a term used for the spreading of a harmful idea or practice. Social contagion refers to the way in which ideas, emotions, and behaviors spread from person to person. In the context of the struggling artist, it allows mental illness to fester, to be glamorized and admired, even encouraged in the name of art. So when an artist is mentally ill, we see the art they produce as a result of mental illness as something almost magical. Which, it certainly can be, but neither do we step forward to help them out of it for some reason, or encourage the idea of art as being something more than stemming from suffering or illness. Happy-go-lucky artists never seem to be taken quite as seriously as the artists who have obviously gone through or are currently undergoing mental trauma or difficulties or pain. But at the same time, the great paradox is that artists who have gone through mental trauma are expected to live with mental trauma in order to produce great art for the rest of us so-called normal folk to gaze at and lavish praise upon. A great paragraph in the article talks about some statistics. Earlier, in 2018, a study by the Inspire Wellbeing Charity and Ulster University found that creative workers were 3 times more likely to suffer from mental health problems. Having a creative career can come at a high price. 60% of creative workers who took part in the study spoke of having suicidal thoughts. Many writers, artists, and musicians suffer untimely deaths, some of which could presumably have been prevented if mental illness wasn't so romanticized by society and seen as an inherent part of creative self-expression, a pattern that musician Jeff Tweedy, who suffered from drug addiction, described as a destructive myth. A piece for a website called Sane Australia talks about this too. "Look how sick I am. Doesn't this mean I'm different, that I'm a true artist?" While Peter doesn't draw attention necessarily to his depressive psychosis in a meaningful "look at me everyone, aren't I such an artist," he's obviously visibly struggling, at least when we first meet him. He's heavily addicted to drugs, drink, and is also massively depressed. His position as the artist merely encourages that kind of self-reflection. Cast Peter as the hero of the story for a moment. TV Tropes has a wonderful definition for a classical anti-hero, the sort of character you could compare to, say, Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman. They say, in classical and earlier mythology, the hero tended to be a dashing, confident, stoic, intelligent, highly capable fighter and commander with few, if any, flaws and even fewer real weaknesses. The classical anti-hero is the inversion of this. Where the hero is confident, the anti-hero is plagued by self-doubt. Where the hero is a respected fighter, the anti-hero is mediocre at best. Where the hero is brave and courageous, the anti-hero is frightened and cowardly. Where the hero gets all the ladies, the anti-hero can't even get the time of day. Peter is struck with an incredible amount of self-doubt. He hides away in his apartment and occasionally comes to the bar to binge drink, and is fixated on a thing he can never have. He is self-obsessed to a harmful degree, obsessing over his failures to the detriment of his overall health. Peter is someone who sees a tragic beauty in every sunrise and sunset. The actions of the player can help him climb from that dark pit in which he finds himself, or leave him to die in sorrow. There are fine things, old boy, which are more brilliant when unfinished than when finished too much, he says. His best line, in my opinion. Perhaps one of the best in the whole game. Maybe this is his way of internalizing the polyhedron's uniquely awful quandary that it presents to him, but I think it shows something else about him. Peter is a character with a self-destructive, somewhat narcissistic personality, but he also sees the beauty in everything. There's a reason so many people love Peter Stamatin. He's a character who resonates with a lot of people. A man stuck fixated on a past failure, which causes him to spiral out of control. We all fall prey to this at one point or another, looking back. It is why Pathologic affects everyone who plays it. The character's human emotions and relationships have been thought out carefully, so carefully that everyone will pick out a different character as their favourite. Yet there's a great general love for Peter, because he is very easy to grasp and struggles with the idea of the self, just like some other characters I've already discussed. The process of playing Pathologic is figuring out what place you fit into the world, sealing fates and helping other people. Peter's attitude toward other human beings exists in a quote from Ivan Karamazov. One can love one's neighbours in the abstract or even at a distance, but at close quarters it's almost impossible. Peter is distant and unlikable. With few able to understand him, he tries less and less to explain himself. The fact he was accused of murder does not help matters either, I'd imagine. But it is Grace, the girl who lives in the graveyard, who helps him reacquire some of his self-belief. Whether or not you think an individual like Peter deserves it, after his potential for murder, it is one of the most genuine, beautiful relationships in the game. Love for love's sake, Grace re-energizes Peter, and Peter re-energizes her. She makes him emerge from his shell a bit. He lived dependent on others. Now he seems to realize that he can depend on himself a bit more again. Another wry nod from Iceberg Lodge to Dostoyevsky. You may be surprised at me, Alyosha, but I am awfully fond of children too. And observe, cruel people, the violent, the rapacious, the Karamazovs are sometimes very fond of children, Ivan says. Perhaps that is what we need in this infinitely troubled time we live in. A retreat from the idea of other dependence, and yet avoidance of self-obsession to the point of mentally damaging oneself. Instead, self-care alongside love for others who actually love you. Perhaps Peter is a symbol not just of the broken artist, but of the artist who can reform. In Japan, when a cup smashes, they join it back together with gold. Beauty in the wake of invisible ruin, of addiction, inspiration when all seems lost. This is an incredible cliché, of course. But, sometimes a cliché, if it's done well, feels quite rewarding. Certainly the cliché of a man finding a love for life again from their child exists. But it is far better than the cliché of the infinitely tortured artist who exists simultaneously as an object of fascination, genius, and ridicule. Peter is all these things at once, and that is why people find in him a kindred spirit, a home away from home. He is both the hopeless and the hopeful, the idea of all that we want to be and the reality of what we sometimes feel. Art is wonderful and meaningful to so many of us, yet the commodification of art has made it more difficult to find movements, and often we toil at things we love to the point of exhaustion, simply because we are expected to monetize and justify engaging with art, which should be something that frees all of us, as Peter believes. The polyhedron is a staircase to heaven. Free, immediate expression, the love of the world and all its beauty for beauty's sake, the idea of creation in the palm of a human hand, of taking fire from the gods. It all requires one to live in the moment, as Peter says. Never allow yourself any time to think. That's how you get to heaven. Take care of yourselves and look out for those close to you. It's what's best for all of us. Hi everyone. Hope you enjoyed this video. This was another pleasure to write. It honestly made me want to write some kind of Bowie analysis series as well. Though, of course, a lot of that stuff already exists out there. Maybe one day I might do a few for fun or something. So, as always, make sure to like the video so I know this is what people are engaging with and responding to. Thanks so much for watching. Very much appreciated. Stay safe, everyone.